Hello English Language, PowerPoint lecture for language and occupation, which is one of the topics for paper 2 language varieties. Okay, so alongside genderlect and sociolect, we look at how your occupation can affect your language use. So if you missed the lecture, then there is an activity here on the slide that you can have a little go at to give you some examples and data to be able to use in an essay or in your own journalism. Okay, so just to remind you of the concept of a discourse community, okay, and there's a definition here from John Swales. A discourse community is a group of people who do all three of these things. They communicate internally, that is, amongst themselves, and they use and own one or more genres of communication. So if we think of, I will use the example of education for now. So if you think of the example of education and say all the teachers in a school, they communicate internally. They will have meetings, they will have emails sent to them from people who are managing them. They'll have training together, and they will also hang out together in the staff room, and they will communicate just with other teachers when they're doing those things. And they also use or own some genres of communication. So the biggest ones in occupation are meetings, how meetings are run, but they can also have one-to-one. So they will often have one-to-one with their managers, talk about how things are going. They will have certain written genres, for example, work schemes, lesson plans, the materials they produce. So that's what we mean by genres, spoken and written genres that have certain rules within their organisation. They will use specialist lexis and discourse. So teachers will have a whole bunch of words. Either the lexis or the semantics are specific to the educational context and their jobs. And they will also have specialist discourse, for example, running a class. That's a certain kind of discourse structure that only happens in the teaching profession. And they possess the required level of knowledge and skill to be considered eligible to participate in the community. That's what's really interesting about discourse communities. You sort of have to earn the right to belong to them by how you speak. So if you yourself have a job and you've only just started in the job, you won't yet fully be part of the discourse community. There may well be words that are used or expressions that are used that you don't know yet. And you will learn them as you go along, and then you'll become a fully fledged part of that discourse community. So this can be something, for example, if you have an occupation not that you're being paid for, but just something you enjoy doing in your life, and you'll learn the language of that activity. So this definitely applies to occupational discourse. So different language levels that we can consider when we look at language and discourse is the language used by people in that occupation when they're just talking to one another. So specialist lexis and semantics is part of what we might call insider language. That's the language used between the people in the same occupation when they are only talking to one another. Not all occupations have an outward facing part of their job, but some do. But we're talking about when they're just all together. So we can use all these different terms. Specialized lexis refers to the lexis which is only used in that profession. Specialist semantics, it can be words that we use all over the place, but it has a meaning that is specific in the occupational context. So for example, the text that you will have had when you're in class with the air traffic controllers talking to one another, they use the word squawk. Now, squawk is a word that is generally understood, but they use it with a specific meaning. So it has an occupational context. It becomes an occupational slang word. Squawk is a four-number code. Jargon, when people use the word jargon, often they're talking about acronyms and abbreviations and things like that. And then very informal slang. Lots and lots of professions and jobs also have very informal slang that they use. And the other thing you will find is there's specialised lexis used for products processes and employees within an occupation. So when people within an occupation are speaking with one another, the register is likely to be more informal than when they're talking to people they have to deal with as customers or people using their services. So very often people look at medical language and looking at the language used by hospital staff when they're speaking to one another compared to how they speak when they're speaking to patients and visitors, for example. The insider jargon and slang is highly informal and is not used in the presence of outsiders and is often created to be unintelligible to outsiders, but also often, sometimes quite insulting, or comes across as insulting. And then there's also the use of codes. Okay, so they can be code words or they can literally be codes, numbers and letters. And these are often used in retail and hospitality for tannoy announcements, so that if there's something sensitive but it has to be put out across the tannoy, the outsiders don't understand what it means. So this can be particularly if people suspect someone is stealing from the store or there's someone dangerous in the store. They can put out a tannoy announcement that sounds quite innocuous, like we need more beer in aisle 4, but actually that's a code to say there's somebody dodgy in aisle 4. So there's an activity here, but you would have done that in class, but it's useful to remind yourself of that when you're revising, because that's an example that you can then use in your answers. So one of the most interesting things when we look at language and occupation is how the language reflects power and can actually enact power. So some professions have language that is described as having restricted usage, which is specialised vocabulary that's only ever used in a specific occupation. And much restricted lexis, which is what we call this, in high status professions, for example, medicine or the law, has French and Latin roots. And both French and Latin are languages with high status in British society. Education in them was historically restricted to higher class males. So this language already has a sort of prestige and status. So professions that use this kind of language can exert power over the commoners who are unable to speak this language. So you will remember doing this activity, looking at language of law and how many of these words come from Latin or Old French. And how they create a language completely opaque to outsiders. And that gives people in the legal profession a certain amount of power over their clients or people in courtrooms, because we can't understand what they're talking about, but these are really important aspects of the legal court cases and can actually have real impact in the world. So that's talking about lexis and semantics. The other language level that's important when we look at language and occupation is these very unusual discourse structures that you only get in occupational settings. So work talk, talking at work, is often highly structured, either talking amongst professionals or talking to outsiders. Discourse is likely to be highly goal orientated. So unlike normal conversation, spontaneous conversation between friends and family and even strangers on a bus, this talk has got a goal, it's got an aim that participants are going towards. We talked about this when we looked at discourse, how teacher talk has this unusual pattern of initiation, response, and then feedback from the teacher. Normal conversation goes initiation, response, and that's an adjacency pair, if you remember that term. And that's how discourse is often built up. Now, the adjacency pair can be question, answer, can be statement, statement, can be greeting, greeting. But in teacher talk, you often get question, answer, and then the teacher gives feedback on the answer. So that's just very specific to instruction and would be very odd outside of a teaching situation. There's another kind of discourse structure that's very specific, which we are calling service encounters. And that's when someone goes into a shop or a restaurant or anywhere that offers a service to the public and tries to get the service out of the place. And they have certain obligatory elements to them that we can talk about. And the other thing that often happens with discourse in an occupational setting is you get asymmetrical discourse. That is, one participant will have a great deal more power than another, and that can affect how discourse works. So, a bit more about service encounters. This is a joint activity in which a commodity is exchanged between the service provider and the service seeker. For example, you go into a shop, you want to buy a newspaper, that's a service encounter. You may be physically present in the shop, or you may be on the phone talking to a person, but these do have to be real people. Okay, this is not buying something on the internet where you don't actually speak to a person. Like lots of occupational discourse, it's transactional with clear goals. However, because it's two people speaking to each other, there often is some non-transactional talk embedded. And politeness practices and face considerations play a really important role when you're negotiating service. And that can differ depending on what the expected norms are within different communities of practice. Excuse me. So we've talked about how different American politeness practices are to British ones. And it's very interesting when an American company, like an American fast food company or an American coffee bar, opens in Britain and brings along its politeness practices to the service encounters. And they can play very differently in a British context than an American one. So, in a service encounter, you always have your service provider and your service receiver, let's say, shop assistant, customer. And the main transactional goal is giving or obtaining service. So you might be trying to buy something, or you might be getting a service, i.e. a haircut or a nail polish. And these are some of the elements, some of them that are always in the transaction and others that can be, but not always. So if you're being very quick, these are the minimum things. The person who wants the sale requests it. This is what I like. The person who's serving them says, I can help you. The sale, and then some sort of purchase closure. If you have more time, if it's a longer service encounter, you can have other elements. But the obligatory elements have to happen in that order. And in fact, when you look at the optional elements, they also have to happen in a certain order. So if you're going to have the full service encounter, you would have a greeting, either a sales initiation or a sales inquiry. Sales initiation is when the server offers you, do you want this? Can I help you? Blah, blah, blah. But it could be started by a sales inquiry. You go up to the server and say, hello, I'm looking for blah. Okay? But they still have to happen in that order if they happen. And then finally, when you know what you want to buy, then you go to the obligatory element, your sale request. I'd like this one, please. And they go, of course, madam, certainly. And then they say, that would be £27, please. That's the sale. That's the sale bit. And then the purchase closure, there you go. There's your money. And if you're going to be polite, you then have something called the finis at the end, where you say, thank you, bye-bye, that kind of thing. Certainly in the British situation, the service encounter contains lots of negative politeness. Remember, negative politeness doesn't mean bad politeness. It means politeness that is achieving a goal that could be seen as a negative goal, i.e. not imposing on others. So the customer or the service receiver will take care not to impose on the person giving them. So they'll say please, they'll say thank you, things like that. Similarly, the service provider, once they've asked for your money, will be polite to you. And when they ask for the money, they're polite to you. They're not imposing on you. So there's a lot of negative politeness in service encounter. There can also be some small talk, yeah, and that can very much depend on what kind of service encounter it is. So some occupations contain a substantial amount of this kind of small talk or relational talk, and that's often because of the length of the encounter. and also the fact that you repeatedly go back to the same person for the service. So hairdressers, beauty salons, driving lessons, for example, there's a long period in which you're providing the service where you're not talking about the service. That gap will very often be filled with small talk. But other service encounters will have very little. For example, an emergency call. Yeah, the emergency responder is not going to ask you about the weather or how your day's been. Well, it wouldn't be appropriate, and it wouldn't, they need to be fast. So just once again, for you to think about your experience, to give you some nice examples to use in the exam. Particularly interesting if you yourself are a service provider, to think about what things you are given to say. Are you given a full script that you then sort of mentally run through? So yeah, just have some notes of some good examples that you can use. Occupation is very interesting when it comes to the power relationships in workplaces and occupational settings. And when we're thinking about power and language, that comes under the heading of pragmatics, because it's in pragmatics that we can spot power relationships through language. Some people in some occupations have real power over others. I mean, generally speaking, your employer has power over you. Your boss, your line manager, whatever name is given to that person, they have what we call real power or instrumental power, because they assess your work, they give you different jobs and roles, they can promote you, they can demote you. If the worst comes to the worst, they can sack you. So they have real power. Teachers over students have real power. They have some legal responsibilities over students, and also they control a disciplinary process over students. And, at the final remove, teachers can exclude students. Doctors have real power over patients. There are some treatments that they can actually insist on. Two doctors together can commit someone to a psychiatric unit, for example. So doctors have some real power over people. But then there are other people who have influential power, people who try to persuade you in an occupational setting, so salespeople and promotional material from occupations, from businesses, try to persuade you. They don't actually have power. Well, they don't have real power, but they have the power of advertising and things like that. Speakers with real power often attempt to mitigate their power in order to meet your face needs, not to be imposed upon. And the things they will use to mitigate their power include politeness, using disguised directives, that is, not using a bold imperative and saying, shut that window, but saying, could you shut the window? Which looks like a question. Or there's quite a draft in here, which is just a statement, but they are aimed at asking you to do something without imposing on you. And you'll notice those often also use weak modals. Those are all ways in which, so could, should, might, those can also mitigate power. And in many occupations, what you call different people within the hierarchy can imply power relationships. People with more power over others in a conversation leads to what is called asymmetrical discourse. Yeah, because people are not equal, there's an unbalance. And there's a couple of researchers here, Drew and Heritage, who did a big study called Talk at Work, and they looked at what the effect of hierarchies of power within organisations have on language. And they're the people who came up with this idea of asymmetrical discourse. And it just describes the sort of talk you get when there's unequal power relationship between the participants. And as we mentioned earlier, managers have instrumental power over the people they manage. They can discipline and ultimately sack workers, or they can also promote and reward them. So these are some of the features that you can find in asymmetrical discourse. The person with the most power has more control over the discourse than would happen in an everyday conversation. And these are some of the ways in which they do control the discourse. They ask the most questions, they control the topic, they speak the most, they control who speaks and when. They can use less formal terms of address for people less powerful than them. and more formal terms of address are used of them. And basically, they pursue their goals. So if you think about the classroom, that's a classic. You can see all of those things happening in the classroom. But if you could see a meeting in which, you know, the head of a large department was running a meeting, you would see them using all these things as well. What can those who don't have any power do in that situation? They can't do those things. They don't have the power to do any of those things. But what they can do is not say anything, so they can respond with silence or with very minimal responses. And also when they do get their turn, they can try and keep it for a long, long time. But that doesn't show they've got power. It just shows what they can do if they're not happy with how little power they have. So just in terms of language levels, to be aware of the sort of grammatical terms to be using and to be familiar with, look at questions or interrogatives and the kinds of interrogatives that are used. Imperatives may be disguised as interrogatives or declaratives. Yeah, that idea of a disguised directive. If an organisation is trying to be persuasive, they will often use personal pronouns. And we've already mentioned the idea of modal verbs. They're weak for persuasive power, but they could be strong if someone has instrumental power. So, for example, when we looked at the exam board's warnings to students outside exams, they will use words like must, should, will. Yeah, really strong modal verbs to show they have the power. So pragmatics is about relationships. It's about things that are inferred or implied through language. And one of the ways you can see what power relationships are at work can be seen in the terms of address that are used between workers and between different hierarchical levels. Highly formal workplaces often use terms of address and titles to differentiate by ranks and status. So if you think about things like the police force, the armed forces, they have very, very strong titling of who has more power. Some more modern workplaces choose to use first names or equal titles. So Waitrose and John Lewis calls everybody a partner. I think Tesco now calls everybody a colleague. Okay, this doesn't mean that there aren't strong hierarchical power relationships. It just means they're not being expressed in terms of address. It reflects how society has embraced more egalitarian and meritocratic values over the last 100 years. We've become a much more informal society and a much less outwardly hierarchical society. Okay, so you should have some notes on the terms of address used in occupational contexts you're familiar with, how they reflect relationships of power, and if you are in a job, think about how spoken interactions reflect who has power in your occupational setting. Otherwise, think about school and college for examples of this, because that's an occupational setting you are all familiar with, although not what happens in the staff room.